Marie Colvin was an American journalist who worked for the British newspaper The Sunday Times until her death whilst covering the siege of Homs in Syria in February 2012. With her body was her rucksack, which contained only essential survival items, and the draft of a novel by her friend Gerald Weaver. Colvin's death made headlines worldwide.
The relentless assault on Syrian cities claimed dozens of lives today, including two well-known Western journalists. In the besieged neighborhoods of Homs, the explosions came every few seconds. Listen.
من المعارضة السورية وشهود أن الصحفية الأمريكية ماري كولفين.
Well, Marie had been in Homs last week covering the victims of the massacre that is essentially going on there. But she discovered when she went back on Monday and Tuesday that the shelling was getting much worse. And she was about to leave tonight in anticipation of more trouble and a possible invasion of the area when she was caught up in this, what we believe is a shelling of a press center they'd set up. And it seemed to have been a direct hit, and she was buried under the rubble.
At least 20 people died there, among them the legendary American war correspondent Marie Colvin and the French photographer Remy Oclique.
I'm sitting here in the basement of Davenport College at Yale in New Haven, Connecticut, the hallowed halls. And I'm here with a Yale alumni who has written a book, and it's a fabulous piece of work. It's called Gospel Prism. The author is Gerald Weaver, and as I said, Gerald studied here at Yale. And one of the things that has marked this book out is who he studied with, because it was a really interesting year. Gerald.
Yes, I first met Marie Colvin here at Yale University in 1975, and she immediately struck me as someone who was bold and passionate, unconventional, very willing to try new things. And even though she was sort of quiet on the surface and had a much more flamboyant friend that all the boys were chasing, I immediately was struck by Marie and went right up to her. And we began a conversation that never really ended. And we talked about books and life and politics, and became boyfriend and girlfriend for a while. And then that sort of ended and then picked back up again after we graduated for a while. And then she moved to France, and we stayed in touch on and off throughout the years, and particularly a lot in the last few years of her life.
What were you studying here at Yale?
I studied history, and Marie studied anthropology, and she always kept a journal, so she was a writer from the beginning. Late in her career at Yale, her junior year, she went to work for the Yale Daily News, and then found her calling, which was to write. But she had always been interested in books, and so was I. And for a history major and anthropology major, we both took a lot of English courses and talked a lot about the books that are part of my novel.
Exactly, and that's my point, is that books are a very strong theme all the way through your novel. But I want to go back to really your life story. What happened after Yale?
Well, I went to law school, didn't much like it. Then I went to Capitol Hill, where I was an intern, and there I became a legislative assistant. I taught myself how to run a campaign, and I went and ran a sort of daring campaign for a challenger against an entrenched incumbent, and we won. So I came back as his chief of staff. I was 25, and I just turned 26, and I was the youngest chief of staff by quite a margin on the U.S. House of Representatives side. And I finished my degree, my law school degree, going to school at night. I became a lawyer lobbyist, and I had my own lobbying firm. And then that's when the wheels came off.
Well, tell me about that.
There was a thing known as the U.S. House Post Office investigation, and the U.S. attorney at the time was contemplating a run for Senate in Virginia, and he wanted to make political hay. And the assistant U.S. attorney came to me asking me to basically tell all I knew about various members of Congress, and I wouldn't do it. So he rounded up 6 of my friends who I had done recreational drugs with years before, but had stopped myself, and he called that a conspiracy and held me responsible for the actions of the conspiracy after I had left it, and indicted me on conspiracy to distribute cocaine. And I was facing, because Ronald Reagan had instituted mandatory minimums, it was the kind of case you would want to try before, because even if you lost, you would get no sentence. But because of the mandatory minimums, there was a possible 7-year sentence for me. It was just too long to be away from my family. So I took a deal for 2 years in prison, and then it turned out that my lawyer who made the deal had engaged in a conflict of interest, so my judge let me out in 16 months.
And how was that time in prison?
It's difficult to explain. There are, a million bad things about it. You're stuck in a place with 300 men, and, when there are a lot of men together, they could be well educated, and it's just not a good place to be. There's just too much testosterone. But these men ranged from white-collar criminals to actual murderers and organized crime figures who had either gotten lighter sentences than they deserved or who had moved down from more serious prisons in the later parts of their terms. And then, of course, you're restricted and denied movement, and you can't see your family. But the main three things that are a problem were the threat of violence and then boredom and also dissipation. You can become sort of less of a person than you went in as.
And there was no separation then between different kinds of criminals?
No, and I went in there not letting people know I had any legal training because everybody hates their lawyers, and they hate the lawyers that prosecuted them. But after I was protected in the beginning, and then I felt more comfortable and people respected me, I let them know. So then I was inundated by men bringing me their cases and their appeals, and I found a great many actual innocent men in Yale, which was in jail, I mean, which was an actual, was some of the most harrowing and horrible reading I've ever done in my life, and I've read all my life. And then I would also see these cases where the men had, like for instance, this one man, he and his brothers were burglars in the suburbs of Las Vegas, and they found the people at home, they would kill them. And he actually wanted me to work on his case, and I absolutely had no idea what to say to him. And I just knew I wanted to get as far away from him as possible. But there were people like that there.
And it was actually where this book then had its genesis. So tell me how that came about.
Yes, like I said, I made, because of those problems of prison, of boredom, dissipation, and violence, I stayed in a library, I stayed in my room, I did a lot of reading, I did some working out, and my mantra was self-improvement. I was not going to let those months in prison do anything that would make me less of a person. So I did get in better shape, I lost weight, and I read and read and read and read. And then later, when I was talking to Marie about books and about the books I read and the books we shared and the books we loved, and I was talking about prisons, she said, you can put those together. And then I immediately said, you're right. I can recognize right now a Don Quixote scenario and a Merchant of Venice scenario. And then I kept thinking about it. And those great works became the sort of basis or foundation on which I built each chapter of the book.
Now, the book famously was one of the very few things Marie Colvin was carrying when she died. And she just had, well, tell me what was in her rucksack.
Right. This is always kind of hard for me to talk about, but she died on February 22nd, 2012. Her body was buried in Syria because they wanted to keep it from the Syrian officials in the State Department. And the Sunday Times finally got it out and sent it home, and then there was a funeral in March in Long Island, and I went to it, and then her sister came up to me, I'd never met her, and said, that we got Marie's body back with her knapsack, and inside of it was, sets of clean underwear, a satellite phone, and this big white box with your manuscript in it. And she said, I know Marie was talking to an agent, so she sent it on to that agent. But, if you read Paul Conroy's book, Under the Wire, you know that she's carried that over barbed wire fences and crawled through a 100-yard sewer three times with that knapsack and that book. So for me, it's this tremendous obligation as well as an honor that I have to do something with this book that she, I say, if the book were our baby, she was the father and I was the mother, because I gave birth to it, but she seeded me with the ideas.
And in fact, it was something that you talked about or emailed about on a daily basis.
On a daily basis, as was possible with Marie. I mean, she was running around a lot, but I would email her every morning, and she would email me back most mornings, and lots of times I wouldn't hear from her for a week, and then I would get a phone call. So she was about as religious in getting in touch with me as she was possibly capable of being. But I made a point of writing her every day. I began my day at 5 a.m. with an email to her telling her what I was up to, and then I would begin to write.
And it's interesting that you use the word religious there, because of course religion is something that features in this book, indeed even the name, Gospel Prism.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I first crafted the book along the lines that Marie and I had discussed, which were through 12 chapters set in prison. And the first chapter is Don Quixote, and the second one is the Essays of Montaigne, and the third one's The Merchant of Venice, and then Dante's Inferno and Milton's Paradise Lost, etc. But I needed to come up with a strong narrative thread to weave through all those stories. And I had this idea that billions of people worship essentially a character in a book, whether it's Allah in the Quran or Jesus and God in the Bible or Yahweh in the Tanakh. I mean, there's essentially that comes from a book for most people. I mean, that's their first experience of it. And I figured, well, there's divine wisdom in other books too. So in my novel, a mystical figure who's a beautiful mixed-race female version of Jesus asks the hero Christian to find these divine truths in the stories of his prison life, which are also the paraphrasings of these great works of literature. So he's able, at her insistence, to draw divine truths or essential wisdoms from the various stories of his life in prison, which are also stories of those great books.
I was particularly struck by one chapter about Sicilian roots. Tell me about that.
Yeah, that's the Merchant of Venice chapter. It's actually the first one that jumped out to me because there are mob men in prison, and they had cut a deal with the rabbi who was in prison, and he was shipping in contraband into kosher shipments, which the guards wouldn't touch. So it truly was this negotiation between a Jewish man and this Italian group, and it was very Merchant of Venice. And those mob guys adopted me because I went to the tailor first day and got my prison khakis. And the tailor asked me if I was Italian because I looked that way. And I told him my mother was Sicilian, and we talked about it. And so it's a harrowing experience to put in prison. You feel like you have a target on your back, and you don't know what's going to happen. And I didn't sleep for 3 days. And then on the third day, the fourth day, the head of the organized crime group in prison, Big Frank, waved at me and had me sit on the park bench next to him in the middle of the prison outside the mess hall, and we talked for a while. Basically, he was gleaning whether or not I had Sicilian roots and I knew the proper Italian words and customs, and I did. So after 15 minutes, he said, "You can go now." He just literally dismissed me, and then he said, "And you can sleep from now on, because now that you've been seen talking to me, no one will mess with you." So he was my initial source of protection. And then at one point, my Sicilian mother came to visit, and he put his hand on her, and he said, on her shoulder, and he said, "Don't worry, Gerald is going to be safe. I'm going to be looking after him." And my mother, partly because she's Mediterranean, is a world-class worrier, and nothing I had said or nothing I could have done would have ever caused her not to worry. But the instant that Big Frank, this Sicilian mobster, told her that I was under his protection, she stopped worrying.
Let's talk about your family a little bit and how this time in prison affected them.
I'll never forget that first day my wife and 2 children came to visit. My daughter Harriet was 2 and my son Simon was 4. And to them, they hadn't seen their dad in a while. They didn't know what's going on. They were happy to see me. They jumped all over me in the visitor room, and we spent some good hours. And then when they were leaving, they were walking down the walkway, and my little 2-year-old girl turned around and looked at me, and I could tell she was wondering why Dad wasn't following. So prison's this horrible thing, but in a way, it would almost be good if everyone could spend some time there, because a day didn't pass when I didn't go into the bathroom and hide in the stall and cry, or lie in bed and cry, because I missed my children and my wife so much. And I realized that as glamorous and powerful and interesting a job I had, and a good salary and expense accounts, I didn't miss any of that for 1 second. And I really missed my children and my wife. So it was a tremendous way to get your priorities straightened.
And Marie at that time was traveling the world. You were still in touch.
Marie was one of the few people who contacted me right after I got out of prison to basically tell me, "Don't worry about it, it's all right, you're still cool." And then through that period that followed, we would get in touch when some event would happen, a divorce or a change of jobs and things like that. But yeah, she was one of the few who came forward and told me, "Don't worry about having been in prison." And it's hard to explain. Prison sort of gives you, whether or not your level of guilt is great or small or whatever, you see your name on page 3 of the Washington Post, and you do this thing where you're constantly being set upon by authority, and you just have a certain amount of shame when you come out that's almost inescapable. So having friends like Marie Colvin say, don't worry about it, it's fine, was really useful.
Where did you go after prison?
I spent some time as a stay-at-home dad, and then I did some legal research work, and I sued the lawyer who was guilty of the conflict of interest, and I got a very, very nice settlement out of that, and I invested that in real estate and made some money that way. I taught English and Latin and coached baseball and basketball at the local high school, invested some more money in Chinese antiquities and did well with that, and then I had a conversation with my second wife, and we decided that I would take the time to write this book, which actually Marie had told me to write in 2010, so that's what I did. I became a full-time writer at that point.
And here we are back at Yale, and of course, as we've seen, what you learnt at Yale very much within that book. Of course, the friendship you made at Yale with Marie also very much reflected in that book. And the Yale's Writers' Conference, which is where we are now, which is where we've met, and something that you were on, in fact, when you were writing this book.
Right, that's exactly right. I mean, Yale fits in at the beginning, not just from knowing Marie, but I had a class from Harold Bloom, who's put the blurb on the back of my book, and he's just inspired me very much by his transports of almost transcendent love for great literature. It sort of was very easy to soak up his enthusiasm for that, and I realized there was something to it at that point. And at Yale, I also took a course from Gordon Lish, who was famously Raymond Carver's editor, and some people say really Raymond Carver, and he also told me I could write. So I had that germ that I got from Yale. And at the other end of it, the Yale Writers' Conference was helpful at one point, because I had an editor at the original London agency who helped him with the book, and I had some other people edit it. When I came here to the Yale Writers' Conference, I brought the first chapter, and my fellow students and my teacher actually rearranged it in a way, I think, that made it much, much more easy to get into the book from the very beginning. So this Yale Writers' Conference was a tremendous help.
And in fact, the American launch of the book took place here at Yale.
Well, you could say that. I mean, it's only been published in the United Kingdom, and of course, it's available on Amazon worldwide. You can get it on Amazon France and Amazon Japan, for instance, but you can only get it in a bookstore if you're in the United Kingdom, and it's published in the United Kingdom. But my publicist said, if you're at the Yale Writers' Conference, you should have a book party. So essentially, you're right, the launch of the book in America was here because we had a book party, and amazingly, many of my Yale alumni friends showed up from the area, but a good deal of the other students here at the Yale Writers' Conference came, and it was very fun, very interesting.
I'm interested in the role that an event like this conference plays for writers. I mean, you were talking about how the other students helped you refine the first chapter. Is it because in one way, this could just be a talking shop. It could be a lot of people just sitting around a table, tearing each other to shreds, actually. But that's not the case for you. It was helpful.
Well, yeah, and I mean, fortunately, I'm old enough that criticism doesn't really bother me, and I seek it, and I enjoy it. And not only in the first session where I got help editing the beginning of Gospel Prism, but also in any one of these situations, you're going to get certain criticisms that you realize there can be like rules. There's certain things you want to do. You want to create questions and then answer them later. And so the criticisms you get, if you keep notes, they actually help you in the future or in other books and make you a better writer. And it never, ever, ever hurts. And I urge this to writers everywhere, to let people see your work and to get their input. You'll know what's right and what's wrong and what fits and what doesn't, and it's just always very useful, and that's probably the greatest value of something like this.
Now, this book is very clever, and it has a tremendous amount of literary references. What if you haven't read those books? Can you still enjoy Gospel Prism?
Well, I mean, if it were based on that and it was all that was about, it would be too clever by half, but I think if you know none of those books, you can read it as a fairly gripping tale of how this man's going to get through prison. How's he going to manage the work detail? How's he going to survive? How's he going to deal with the warring factions, the bikers, the mob, the black gangsters? It's going to keep you interested reading all that. And even if you don't know those books, you won't suffer from it. It'll be like an Elmore Leonard story or something. But if you do know them, they kind of rise up out of the text, and you kind of say, "Oh wow, I can see something there." And in the conversation with the beautiful mixed race Messiah that runs through the book, you're sort of directed towards these other great works of literature. And there's that religious element that I mentioned before about finding divine wisdom in books is also sort of has a flip side. And I think that as the current state of books is so rapidly changing, at one point, I think people who truly love and read and spend time with books are in the end going to be like a religious cult themselves.
Finally, Gerald, I understand that a portion of the profits are going to charity.
Right. The charity is the Marie Colvin Memorial Fund, which is based in the United States and is dedicated to the things that she appreciated, journalism and humanitarian works and things like that. And it's part of this sort of, like I said, it was an honor that she had worked with me on this book and thought enough about it to carry it into a very, very dangerous place where she eventually died. But it was also, I felt this obligation to dedicate the book to her and to somehow otherwise, make it contribute to the work she'd been doing. And I wrote the book with her in some ways. I wrote it to her because of their books we discussed. And at this point, I hope to write it and get it sold for her memory, because I don't want people to forget how bold and how compassionate this woman was.
And it's a fabulous book. It's called Gospel Prism, and it's by Gerald Weaver. It's out now.